Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizer, especially to Anna, in my behalf, and Shamir Zalkin behalf, that we work together, and he helped me very much in this lecture. And I will not be talking about Vilnius. I would not be talking about the Great Synagogue, because I have not enough knowledge about it. But I will talk about things I have some knowledge. I'm, by training, I'm an architect. I'm a conservation and preservation architect. And I also, in my studies, I'm archaeologist too. Everything I say here today is from the perspective of preservation. Anyway, meanwhile, I'll continue because the time is short. And as you probably see, preservation for me defined as a careful management of change. And that's what it's all about. How do we deal with the change, with the constant change of those, of architecture, and not only architecture, of course. We will embark to a short journey through the history of architectural preservation in Israel in the last 50 years. The specific cases I mentioned today are mostly UNESCO declared heritage sites, and they are Masada, Tel Aviv, the white city of Tel Aviv, and the black city of Jaffa, and the Churva synagogue in the old quarter of Jerusalem. These are the words of a good friend of mine, even though we have the same name, we are not related. Galia Bar-O, the manager of the Ein Harod Museum, Kibbutz Ein Harod. And I think that's very important to notice that addressing the past requires the ability to tune into different frequencies. The dialogue created between different points of view and time spheres does not ensemble into a unified version. There is a section encourage one another in a relevant context and create their vitality. Okay, we'll start with Masada. I think everybody knows here the Masada. But let me just say a few words about it and why it's relevant. Masada was nominated into UNESCO as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2001, and it was the first site declared by the State of Israel for UNESCO. And it's not by chance that Masada was the first one. The site history spans through thousands of years, from the Chalcolithic period into the Byzantine. Yet its historical peak and the source of its modern significance is its myth. The history took place during the Herodian era, the Great Jewish Revolt, between the end of the 1st century BC and the 1st century after Christ. Masada is a complex of royal pleasure palaces built by the paranoid great King Herod, in the middle of the desert, on top of an inaccessible mountain plateau. During the Great Revolt, the 1st century, rebels from the Jewish Sikariki sect took refuge in the partially abandoned site and used it as a base for raids of the surrounding settlements. At the end of the Roman oppression campaign throughout the land of Israel, an extended siege was held against the Masada settlers until it was finally conquered. According to the Roman Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, and his words are here, which is quite, I would say, quite astonishing and quite horrible. The way they killed each other just because they didn't want to become slaves. Masada was gradually faded from the collective memory, and the interest of the site was revived only in the 50s, the 1950s, when wide-ranging excavations were carried out of the site, followed by, of course, by a series of publications. Towards the end of the 20th century, and preparation for declaration of the UNESCO site in 2001, new excavations were carried out by the first excavation by Igal Yadin, and the second and the main excavation lately were by Ehud Netzer, who was also a great admirer of the fortress leader Elazar ben Yair and his problematic decisions. The myth to Masada was enhanced during the 20th century by the Zionist movement. Zionism is an anti-exile movement that rejects dying in the name of God, al-Kiddush Hashem, and thus consciously adopted the legend of Masada as a decision of Masada that empowers freedom of life. Of course, because of the myth, soldiers are climbing the mountains, youth movement, and almost every school goes there at night, climbing for the dawn to see the sunrise. But the main slogan is, Masada shall not fall again. The murder and the suicide of men, women, and children is a traumatic event by any stretch of imagination. Its conservation to a narrative of heroism serves to illustrate the post-traumatic response known as the Masada complex. The site has become one of the most visited sites in Israel, with roughly 750,000 visitors every year. In order to prepare the sites for the masses, extended preservation, restoration, and reconstruction were carried out at the site and is still done. But what exactly did archaeologists and preservationists preserve? Not the sad reminders of the harried life of the Sikariki rebels, but rather palaces of Herod the Great. The youth climbing the snake path undergo the experience of heroism, expecting to encounter remains of the famous story and the myth, yet see almost nothing from the era, out of the revolt of the massacre. They see fantastic Roman palaces, spectacular mosaic floors, fortified walls, and gates. All these, impressive as they might be, have nothing to do with the commemoration of Masada today. Let us look at another World Heritage Site, which is Tel Aviv, the white city of Tel Aviv. But of course, we cannot start Tel Aviv without talking about Jaffa. Well, Jaffa is as ancient as Jerusalem, probably, because it was the port of Jerusalem. And it was one of the main ports and gateway to Israel, to Palestine. Jaffa was completely destroyed by Napoleon Bonaparte at the end of the 18th century and was rebuilt in the following years by the Ottoman under the governorship of Muhammad Abu Nabut. Jaffa's modern development began with onset of industrial revolution and the European powers' renewed interest in the Middle East. The city walls were destroyed in the middle of the 19th century during the conquest of Palestine by Ibrahim Pasha coming from Egypt. Jaffa's surrounding areas, rich in fertile soil and sources of water, provides ample land for the wide-ranging cultivation of citrus fruits, olives, and grapes. The neighboring port enabled the exportation of agricultural goods and significantly contributed to the economic and urban development of the city and its neighboring city. The spread of settlements beyond the city walls led to the development of commercial and residential areas outside the city center and the construction of suburban neighborhoods. Almost, we can see in the south, Ajami, the mainly Christian quarter, Manshia on the north, which is mainly, what was mainly Muslim, and of course Neve Tzedek, that became in 1909 Ahuzat Bayit, that was founded and became very soon Tel Aviv. That became an independent city since 1920. The new modern Hebrew town was part of Jaffa, grew in a constant conflict with the Arab bride of the sea. The rise of Zionist nationalistic movement at the end of the 19th century and the Jewish accusation of the development of Palestine nationalistic groups, Jaffa became a center of residence and the key player of founding the foundation of the modern Palestine society. The event of the Great Arab Revolt, which erupted in 1936, began in Jaffa, when the British mandatory authorities decided to suppress the revolt in a violent act, specifically in Jaffa, which was the center of the Arab nationalistic movement and intellectual activity, of course. We can see here the Kasbah inside the walls of the old city of Jaffa, as we called. Before, in 1936, before the treatment of the British Army. The treatment was that, as they call it, the anchor operation, because of the shape of the destruction that reminds us as an anchor. And that's and became the main ways in the old city of Jaffa, what was before the Kasbah. During the Israeli War of Independence in 1948, multiple sections of Jaffa were destroyed in a series of military operations to occupy the city. After the war, only about 30% of the building of the old Jaffa remained. And that's how it looks today. In the middle of the city, there is a garden, a huge garden, and only 30% of the buildings were still left. Most of the dense Kasbah became an open green park. And let us go to the quarter of Manshia, which was north of the old city of Jaffa. As I mentioned before, mainly Christian, but also for Jews living there. North of the city began to develop along the coast in the 19th century after the walls were broke. We can see it from the old city towards the north. We can see the dense part of Manshia. This era was not spared of the erasure that happened to all Jaffa. During the 50s, the mayor of Tel Aviv, Israel Rokach, and the municipal engineer, Yaakov Ben Sira, embarked on a post-traumatic initiative to erase completely Manshia. The quarter was subjected to further demolition under the direct instruction of the municipality of Tel Aviv till today. While Jaffa and Tel Aviv became a single united city in 48, development projects have been taking place on top of the historic city center of Jaffa and its neighborhood. Just one example. This is the only remains of the Manshia quarter was the Hassan Bek Mosque that stands alone there with no community, no congregation, and no direct connection with the Muslim population of Jaffa. And, sorry. Yeah. And the Etzel Museum, which I don't see it here. Yeah, it's here. The Etzel Museum, which was the only building that was left there, that became, ironically enough, the museum for the Irgun who destroyed the quarter or conquered it in 48. And this is how Manshia looks today. So the result in Jaffa preservation serves as an additional tool for suppression of the local Palestinian culture, architecture preservation that erases memories and construct an alienated and unrooted reality, an additional reinforcement of the domain of Tel Aviv above Jaffa. So this is the map of declaration at the same time that UNESCO in 2003 declared Tel Aviv as a World Heritage Site, but only the white city of Tel Aviv. You could see in this map, you can hardly see Jaffa, and what is Manshia is mainly Green Park. Okay, so the illusion to create a new city imitates European forms which are foreign to the local environment. And that's our main interest now in conservation in Tel Aviv. The last example is the Churva synagogue, was already mentioned by John, I think, yesterday. The Churva synagogue. The Churva synagogue is situated on the courtyard of the Ashkenazim in the heart of Jerusalem Jewish quarter. This site is probably from the 18th century, built in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, who probably gave the money, and that's why it was named after him. Maybe there are other synagogues below that, but we don't know. Maybe John knows. It seems that the economic aid of Rabbi Yehuda Hasid gave its sudden development, and it was completed actually in 1964. It was designed by the Ottoman architect Assad Effendi, who had been sent by the Sultan to renovate the religious structures on top of the mountain of the Temple Mount. The synagogue was designed in a Byzantine Ottoman style as a mosque. For example, the Al-Amariya Mosque, located next to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the old city of Jerusalem, looks exactly the same. In 1948, the Independence War, the Jews had to abandon the Jewish quarter and the synagogue, of course, and the Jordanian army destroyed it completely, along with other other synagogues and other buildings. In 1967, with the capture of the old city by the Israelis, discussion began concerning the site's redesign, a discussion that touched upon the foundation of creating the Jewish and Zionist identity in the united Jerusalem. The main question then, as now, as with many projects dealing with the destruction and memory, whether the reconstruction of the old building or to build a monumental modern structure that suits the wishes of today. Jerusalem Mayor Teddy Kollek preferred the monumental solution, approaching the architect Ram Karmi with a request to design a new synagogue. Karmi rejected the offer, claiming that the only great architect, Louis Kahn, was worthy to design such a new synagogue with such an important as the Chorva. Kahn visited the site and presented his design for the new synagogue in 68. Nevertheless, Kahn's plans were rejected by the authorities, and a wide-ranging public debate began over the site's future. The years that followed, and this is the Kahn's project, an interesting turn occurred in 1976, when the wake of a rejection of another plan for the building, it was decided to reconstruct one of the old synagogue arches. The reconstruction art stood for approximately 30 years as clear and present reminder of the trauma of the Jordanian occupation and the destruction of the Jerusalem Jewish quarter and the synagogue in the 48 war. The symbolic arch made a profound impression on many visitors. In 2002, a governmental decision was made to fully restore the old synagogue with a budget of millions of dollars. The reconstruction plan were approved immediately afterwards on the basis of archaeological surveys carried out in an earlier years by the Israeli Antiquities Authority, as well as historical photographs. This question was already mentioned a few times, whether the full reconstruction of the synagogue is a proper way to remember the Jewish history in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. Destruction and reconstruction of the past with a new apparent narrative strives to put the synagogues and its dome again in the same position before this 48, together with the domes of the Dome of the Rock and the Sons of, and the Holy Sepulchre Church, those three domes that dominated before 48 the city of Jerusalem. The forced and empty restoration of this site reflects a classical post-traumatic process, one which seeks to erase the memory of trauma through avoidance and total repression, rewriting history and promoting the contemporary Jewish sites and ignoring the past. Now, my question is, what does cultural preservation have to do mismemory. Trying to answer this question, let us have a short look in another place, not in the land of Israel, but in Berlin. The Neues Museum in Berlin, which is, for me, one of the best examples how you keep all the memories in one building, you don't neglect and you don't destroy anything, almost nothing, but you respect every period of time, the time it was built by the Kaiser, the Prussian Kaiser, by the time it was destroyed in the Second World War, the communist time, and the unification of Germany. All those periods are in the same museum. So I would be very brief because I don't have enough time. So it stands in the island, in the museum island in Berlin. The whole museum island was declared as a World Heritage Site in 1999, together with different other museums. And this is very interesting. This is the drawing of the Prussian Emperor Friedrich Wilhelm IV, and made the sketches how his vision for the sanctuary of arts and science in 1841. The museum was designed by Friedrich Stuhler in 1950s. And as it was at that time in the 19th century, when you expose Egyptian antiquities, you expose them in an environment, and Egyptian environment. So actually they created the decor inside the museum. Part of it was Egyptian decor, and that was why it's so interesting. And that other parts, the decor of the other parts, of course, fitting the exhibits. The preparation for the war, and the results of the bombing of the museum. It destroyed it, not completely, but very severely, as you can see here. So what happened? Those decoration, this neoclassical decoration of the 19th century, once they were bombed and damaged, it seems like Pompeii. So the decision what to conserve was quite a decision, because there were so many people who said, leave it like this. Other people said, let's redo it from the beginning. And of course, there was a big discussion. During the time of the DDR, the damaged building remained closed, but still the inquiries and the research, and of course, the dealing with the foundation, to hold the building as one and to take care of it. Only after the reunification, there was an international competition that after the competition, the British architect David Chipperfield took the part of to restore the building and to replan it. And this is his sketch. It says what was left we conserve, what was completely damaged we build in a completely new way. So these are the preservation works that are really only to admire, and this is the result. We can see the original staircase, which was the main entrance and one of the most impressive parts of the building. We see it in the original part. We see the result of the bombing, and you see the staircase today. So you could read quite easily the history. Of course, new parts were completely new and were designed by Chipperfield as a modern constructions and you see it very clearly what is modern and what is original. And if we talk about the frescoes, you could see the original fresco, what happened in the war, and the way he chose to conserve it. He didn't do it completely new, but you could see, you could read, and you could notice what was really happening inside and outside. Of course, he left all the signs of the bullets and the signs of war. The dome, and you see the walls are telling the story with almost, you don't need words. So this is the result. And we can compare the Churva synagogue, which was completely restored, reconstructed, and the Berlin Museum, which was partly reconstructed, but mainly dealing with how we take those traumas and don't eliminate them, but see them in front of us, and remembering them would probably, let's believe, give us a better future. So what he created is a place of dialogue, and I believe what we have to create in a great synagogue is a place of dialogue. Thank you very much.